So good afternoon, everyone. It is a Monday, December the 11th, 2023. We're here, it's 4 p.m. and we're so pleased that you're here to join us for part one of what we think will be a fascinating series on understanding the situation in Israel. This is a three-part series, and it's going to be led by a dear friend and colleague named Mike Hollander. This is under the auspices of our Israel Committee, where Jonathan Sepsenwall is the chair, and Jeff Agron and myself act as we are the staff people for the Israel Committee. So just a few words about Mike Hollander. Mike sent me his bio, but we're pretty good friends. So Michael is originally
you can paraphrase most of it, Mark.
Yeah, I know. I'm just gonna. I'll make it quick. I'm not. Mike gave me like 17 pages of his bio, but he's only getting like a minute.
You only got the first half? That's crazy.
Yeah, that's good, Mike. That was funny. So Mike is originally a fellow Canadian, and we both went to the same undergraduate program at York University in Toronto. Mike was involved in a competing Zionist youth group that I was involved with growing up. Mike made Aliyah in 1988. I lived on a kibbutz. He then moved to Jerusalem. He's been an emissary, a shaliach, in Great Britain. And I have to tell you this about Mike Hollander. Ready? Mike and I, we've gone on the March of the Living together. We've worked together, and this past summer, Mike was the educator and guide for our Temple Beth Shalom trip, which was terrific. And we've already committed to having Michael back with us next summer. I've worked over the years with many guides, with many educators, and Mike is not only bright and intelligent and charismatic, but he's also a great guy. All right, Mike, that's it. That's all I'm going to say about you. I'm going to let you take over. And again, this is part one of a three-part series. The format is Mike is going to teach for about 45 minutes. We'll have time for Q&A that you'll put in the chat group, and I'll read the questions to Mike. And then I'll give you more details about our next part two of the series. So Mike, without any further delay, it's all up to you.
Mark, just one delay. Don't forget to record.
I did.
Mark.
Okay, great.
Already.
If you want to make me co-host, I'm happy to serve in that capacity.
So Shalom, the rabbi is trying to get in, I think, Mark. So a good afternoon to you, or a good evening to me, or a good night to me almost. I speak to you from Modi'in in Israel, which is pretty fortuitous because it is the week of Hanukkah, and I am in the town where Hanukkah became a thing way back when. And my joke in interfaith groups is always that, the joke is that Jesus' favorite holiday had to be Hanukkah because he didn't celebrate Easter and he didn't celebrate Christmas, definitely not Christmas. And this is where it all happened. So I'm in the historic city of the Maccabees, a relatively new city. I'm glad you're all here. I recognize at least three people in the chat. I see Gary and one of the rabbis and Mark. Oh, more of the rest is. There we go. So welcome. We have three parts. Mark and I went backwards and forwards talking about it. Today I'm going to give historical background of the Gaza Strip. Next week, I think we're talking next week, right, Mark? Next week, I'm going to be talking much more about what was going on in Israel, specifically on our 75th year. I have to update that because I have to add a number of slides from the experience that I shared with some of you in June of last year. And then the last session is going to be talking specifically about what has happened since October the 7th. So without further ado, I'm going to ask if you want to put questions up in the chat, you can, but I'm not really going to look at that during my presentation. I'm rather going to figure this one out here. I am rather going to, it's got to go down there. I am instead going to ask you to save the questions for the second part. So we're looking at some sort of historic context. When I showed this to Mark, he's like, Mike, that's not what we talked about. You're right. I just put a title on the three presentations, but we call this now the Operation Swords of Iron. Just in terms of context, it's the longest continuous over 65 days now of engagement militarily Israel has ever had in its 75 years history. And in terms of context, I'm going to look from the time of biblical Samson. I'm going to talk about the first act of violence in Gaza.
Sorry, that's me.
The first, thank you, Marjorie, the first acts of violence from
Progress.
the first acts of violence in 1956, and ultimately we're going to get to what happened on October 7th, just 2 minutes ago. So the biblical connection to Gaza goes back thousands of years. And these images, which are not actual photographs, obviously, of the last great famous battle in the biblical period in Gaza, was when our arch nemesis, the Philistines, lived in Gaza, and our great hero, Shimshon, Samson, who was blinded, but his hair was cut out, his hair regrew, his strength regrew, and he asked his servant in the book of Judges to lead him into the central temple of the Philistines in Gaza, and he destroyed Gaza, the temple. He took his own life, of course, and thousands of Philistines who were thronged inside of this temple. And I chose to begin with this story because the truth of the matter is we have not had a great relationship with the Gaza Strip historically, even in the biblical period. And when one looks at Jewish settlement, Jewish communal life in Judea, Samaria, the West Bank, and Gaza, from after the Six-Day War, very little in Gaza, much more in Judea, Samaria, the West Bank, because that's where much more of the biblical narrative took place. When one hears about the Middle East, and specifically about Israel and the Palestinians, oftentimes thinks that this is the headline. This is a headline, but this is the headline from the 1960s, from June of 1967, fighting in South, right, reporting that Cairo was bombed. Unfortunately, since the beginning, and I say even before 1948, Israel's independence, we've always had issues with Gaza. Now, Gaza is not just a physical place, but I think in a certain sense what we experienced in Gaza since October 7th has to be understood in the much larger context of the Jewish story. And one thing that I put in this presentation that I think is important to understand is kind of how we see the present and how we look to the future. And part of that is colored not just by what happened in the land of Israel, but by what has happened, why is doing this, what has happened in Jewish memory. And you might have heard already in the beginning of October a comparison of what happened on October 7th to the Kishinev pogrom in 1903. In Kishinev, 120 years ago exactly, a population of almost half of the city was Jewish, and there was a blood libel. 49 Jews were killed on April 6th and 7th. A book came out by an American author, Till Zipperstein, from the University of Michigan years ago, talking about this pogrom. And in many ways, this pogrom, at least by the leadership in the Zionist movement and the famous poem, which I'll share with you from Chaim Nachman Bialik in 1903, but the official institutions of state in Israel in the early decades saw this as a very critical moment in Jewish time in 1903. And as the Minister of Education suggested, everything that happened in the Shoah, everything that happened in the Holocaust was already anticipated by what happens in the pogrom. Don't read all the text because I can't read it myself, it's too small. I want to share one thing with you, and that is the end. And why I challenge, and I'm sure a number of you have heard the term, oh, this is another Kishinev. It's not a Kishinev. What happened on October 7th is much worse than a Kishinev on the one hand. On the other hand, what happened in Kishinev happened to defenseless Jews living outside the land of Israel. Today, it's a different situation, as we know, because we've been fighting, now waging war for 65 days. But look at the last paragraph, as how Chaim Nachman Bialik, the Israeli, or not then, the Zionist poet, describes his anger at the passive Jews living in Kishinev. And he says, "Come now, and I will bring you to their lairs, the privies, jakes, and pigpens, where the heirs of the Hasmoneans," that's the Maccabees, with trembling knees, concealed and cowering, the sons of the Maccabees, the seeds of saints, the scions of the lions, who crammed by scores in all the sanctuaries of their shame, so sanctified my name. It was the flight of mice they fled. It was the scurrying of roaches was their flight. They died like dogs, and they were dead. Now, I don't want to go into a whole analysis of Chaim Nachman Bialik and the poem and what happened in Kishinev. I just want us to understand where we were before October the 7th. And we oftentimes will heard two things: that October 7th was the worst day numerically in terms of the number of Jews murdered since the Holocaust, but this was yet another one of those pogroms. You might have heard of Kristallnacht, right? Happened very similar, well, a month beforehand, but numbers of 91 Jews killed in 1938. Etched in Jewish collective memory is Kishinev as a watershed event, really beginning to inspire many people, maybe our great grandparents or grandparents in Central and Eastern Europe, to join the Zionist. Here you can see, and come to Palestine. Here you can see some images of some of that destruction. And I was just last week for the first time at Kibbutz Kfar Aza, since everything happened on October 7th. And in many ways, the destruction from the few images that we have of 1903, or the burial of the Sifrei Torah over here, are very reminiscent of the wanton destruction that we witnessed along the kibbutzim in next to Kfar Aza. Let's fast forward about 3 decades to when Zionism has begun to grow. Jews have begun to move into Palestine, as it was named from the 2nd century, and there begins to be significant Arab opposition to the Jewish growth in Palestine. Now, what happens? The British have a commission of inquiry to try to figure out why there's all of this violence. The British ultimately issue a white paper limiting Jewish immigration, and the belief that there wasn't enough space left in the area that was under their mandate, that the British captured in the First World War. And the major Jewish Zionist response to Arab violence was settlement. Because in 1906, when Tel Aviv was built, in 1896, when the town of Metula on the border with Lebanon was built, unfortunately today it's a ghost town, and I heard in the news 2 hours ago that a mortar was shot into that town, into a house earlier today. But in 1930s, this massive program calling for the construction of almost 60 settlements. Now, settlement may be a negative word in the world press today, but settlement is nothing more than a Jewish community in land that was purchased legally by your grandparents and maybe great-grandparents in the Zionist movement. And the idea, if the Arabs are becoming overly violent, is we will just create more settlements. And the British had a rule that said, if you had a settlement with a wall, a stockade, and a tower, it was considered a settlement and therefore couldn't be dismantled. So 57 were established in the few years in the Arab Revolt. And one night, October 5th, 6th, so literally very similar to October 7th, the end of Yom Kippur in 1946, 10 communities, all these red dots you see on the map on the right-hand side, were established by Jews living in Palestine on land legally purchased. Now, you'll notice one of them, here, Kfar Darom, is actually in this little gray area that is the Gaza Strip. It's not there anymore. There's no Jewish life outside of the tens of thousands of soldiers, but Jews are not living inside the Gaza Strip. But you might notice over here Kibbutz Be'eri, you might notice over here Kibbutz Kedma, Tekuma. These are communities that were established already in the 1940s when 1,000 people and 200 vehicles with these prefab walls and towers put up these new Jewish communities, okay? Important for us to understand the context of what was happening in the 1940s. By 1937, the British, as I said, had begun to realize that their time was probably limited, and it took the British a decade later, although they toyed with the idea of creating a state for the Jews and a state for the Arabs, it took until 1947, when the British turned the political hot potato of Palestine over to the UN, that the UN recommended to partition Palestine and to create 3 entities. You'll notice the color of light blue. That was supposed to be the Jewish state. Most of it, the empty Negev desert. The orange was supposed to be an Arab state, the Galilee, a majority of Jewish population. And ultimately, the map was drawn based on who lived where. North and South Jerusalem, the area later referred to as Jordan as the West Bank, Arab. And over here you'll notice Jaffa, now part of the joint municipality of Tel Aviv. Jaffa was supposed to be part of an Arab country. And here, including the towns of Ashdod and Ashkelon in modern Israel today, and here, in the Gaza Strip down over there, and part of the Negev was supposed to be part of an Arab country. And the third entity, right? Light blue is supposed to be Jewish, barely contiguous. And orange to be Arab, and here you can see the pink was supposed to be part of this Jerusalem international area, accessible somehow to the Jews, but isolated and surrounded by Arab-controlled territory. That was the idea. And our grandparents were euphoric because for the first time in 2 millennia, we've been granted the opportunity of having a country. But they were also a bit troubled by the fact that it was kind of hard to see how we would have contiguity. And what about Jerusalem? And so when our founding fathers declared independence on May 14th, 1948, they didn't mention the borders and they didn't mention Jerusalem. And look what happens. We declare war, and all the countries around us attack us, as do the Arabs within historic Palestine. By the time the map is drawn, and this is a copy of the original map, it's very hard to see, but I put a few arrows in here for you can see. You see those light green arrows? Where the green arrows go, this is the area of the West Bank, which is illegally occupied and annexed by Jordan over here. And just down over here in this tiny little piece of land is Gaza, which, as you will see in 2 maps, falls under the control of the Egyptians. We have here a map of the attacks from all the Arab countries, and we have for the first time a situation in which there is a transference of populations. You could call it that. What happened in India and Pakistan. You could call it hundreds of thousands, maybe 750,000 is the historical estimated number, of Palestinian Arabs who, as a result of the creation of Israel, either run away or are kicked out by Israeli forces. And you've got this creation of a refugee problem of the Palestinians, many of whom settle in the West Bank under Jordanian occupation, and many of whom settle down in Gaza under the Egyptians. When my kids, I didn't say this, but I have 3 kids, 2 eldest are married, 30, 28, and a 25-year-old son, who unfortunately, as we speak, is in and out of Gaza, as he has been for the past 2 months, tragically, but, and he is safe, thankfully, as we speak. But Gaza, for you to understand, and sorry, but my kids, when they grew up in Israel and they went to school in the O's and in the teens, they heard the term Nakba. When I grew up as a kid, I didn't. But that's the Palestinian term, the counter side of the coin that we refer to as our independence. They're referred to as the Great Tragedy. And the tragedy of the Palestinians, I will say, is largely because of these 2 maps. The map on the left, on the right, which was the armistice agreement signed between Israel and Lebanon, Syria, right down up over here, Jordan, or the Hashemite Kingdom of Transjordan, and Egypt down over here. And you'll notice Israel is much larger than the UN partition plan was going to be. But Gaza is occupied by Egypt, and the West Bank and East Jerusalem is occupied by Jordan. In fact, if you look at the map on the left, you'll see what should have been. The blue should have been Israel. The pink and the green and the pink and the green should have been Palestine. But ultimately, the Palestinians are denied, not by Israel, but by the Arab countries, their ability to have their own independent state. And what happens is that the pink areas, supposedly destined, to be an Arab country, fall under Israel. And the pink area over here falls under Jordanian control. There is no independent country of Palestine in 1948. And much of Gaza, the green down over here, and the West Bank is made up of refugees. I'll give you one bracket. For those who have not met me, you know I like putting brackets out there. I spoke to my eldest son. He's 30. He's a contractor. I speak to him almost every day. 2 days ago, we were walking the dog together. He was visiting us after we lit the Hanukkah candles. And I said, so what's going on? He's a contractor. And all of his 20-plus employees live in the West Bank. And none of them have been allowed into Israel because there's a war going on. Today, actually, in the cabinet, they're debating whether to allow Palestinian laborers from the West Bank back into Israel or not. And I asked him, I said, so in their broken Arabic, and you're not in Hebrew, and you're non-existent Arabic, what do they say? He says, he said, the people in the West Bank, his workers, think that the people in Gaza are crazy. They're all the refugees. It's the refugees who are leading everything. And it might not sound so nice to our ears, but there are strata, social strata, economic strata, worldview strata amongst Palestinians. And there are big differences between the Palestinians in the West Bank and Palestinians in Gaza. There's a much higher percentage of refugees in Gaza who are looked down upon by the minority, who are not refugees. And in the West Bank, the majority are not refugees, but that minority of refugees are looked down by the rest of the Palestinians in Gaza. In other words, they don't all necessarily agree with one another. Gaza has a much poorer, much more religious population than the West Bank, and is a much higher percentage of refugees, people who still hold the keys to their home in Jaffa and Tzfat and Ashdod, which is Ashdod, and Ashkelon, the Israeli equivalent. So just to put that in context. Once the border is agreed upon, once the armistice is signed, but the border is not officially agreed on, there's no border with Egypt, violence, very small, of Feda'im, part of Israel, the Negev. And tension escalates in 1956 on a kibbutz called Nachal Oz, which now is in the news, unfortunately. And at the time, Moshe Dayan, with the eye patch, our commander-in-chief, the chief of staff, comes to eulogize a man he literally met the day before, Ray Rotenberg, who is in charge of security on that community, right? We've heard this in the news today about security heads, right? Who part of their job is to maintain the security and to be part of a first responders team within the community. Listen to what is often quoted, one of the most quoted speeches in Israel ever, giving us an understanding already 8 years into Israeli independence, the challenge of Gaza. Yesterday at dawn, Roi was murdered. The quiet of the spring morning blinded him, and he didn't see those who sought his life, hiding behind the furrow. Let us not cast blame today on the murderers. What can we say against their terrible hatred of us? For 8 years now, they've sat in the refugee camps of Gaza. They've watched, and have watched how before their eyes we've turned their land and villages where they and their forefathers previously dwelled into our homes. It is not amongst the Arabs of Gaza, but in our own midst, that we must seek Ru'i's blood. How did we shut our eyes and refuse to look squarely at our fate and see in all its brutality the fate of our generation? Let us today take stock of ourselves. We are a generation of settlement, and without the steel helmet and the gun's muzzle, we will not be able to plant a tree and build a house. Let us not fear to look squarely at the hatred that consumes and fills the lives of hundreds of Arabs who live around us. Let us not drop our gaze lest our arms weaken. That is the fate of our generation. This is our choice, to be ready and armed, tough and hard, or else the sword shall fall from our hands and our lives will be cut short. Already in 1956, Moshe Dayan expresses what we feel so unfortunately painfully today, that without the steel helmet and the gun's muzzle, we will not be able to plant a tree and build a house. Trust me, in our next sessions, 2 from now, we'll talk more about what happened on October the 7th. But already at that point, there's a tension between our desire to live in a place that since 1948, as part of the borders of the state of Israel, tried to extend that olive branch of peace to our neighbors. But even if we extend that olive branch of peace to our neighbors, and tragically many of those people murdered, kidnapped, and whose houses were destroyed in the communities next to Gaza on October 7th, were seekers of peace who actually had a lot of cooperation with people inside the Gaza Strip and hoped to live eventually in peace with them. But that notion already early in the Israeli psyche of the necessity to be aware and concerned and protect ourselves vis-a-vis Gaza. All of this changes in 1967 because some of us are old enough to remember, I'm not, I was born in 1964, the Six-Day War. The tension leading up to the Six-Day War, this feeling, the palpable sense that Israel might not survive in May of 67 and early June. And then by the 10th of June, when the war is all over, Israel wakes up and small little Israel in green, up until 1967, is 3 times the size. We now have this massive land bridge between our greatest enemy, Egypt, and us to protect us. We have control of the Gaza Strip down here. We have control of eastern Jerusalem, fantastically, and Judea, Samaria, the West Bank, and this little section of the Golan Heights, which we capture from Syria. Now, that's good on the one hand, in terms of size. But on the other hand, it poses a challenge of what do we do with all those people who aren't Jewish now within our control? And immediately the response of the government in Israel, left of center, I will add, was to speak to the Arab countries and say, listen, you didn't want us here in 1948. We're here. We've survived. 1956, there was another war. We survived that as well. We proved militarily we're quite strong. We defeated 3 of your armies in 6 days. Let's talk. And maybe give up significant, if not all even, of the land that we captured from you in this war for peace. The Arab League response, as they met in Khartoum, was no to recognition of your right to exist, no to negotiation with Israel, and no to peace with Israel. And so, slowly, in the late 1960s, different governments began to respond, in the late 70s more so, by settling Jews in those 3 territories. Gaza, small numbers; Golan Heights, a little bit larger numbers; and much larger numbers in the northern part of the West Bank, Samaria, and the southern part of the West Bank, Judah. And for 20 years, from 1967, Israel had hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who were our hewers of water and our carvers of trees and our, chippers of layers of stone. And ultimately, much of the manual labor that had been undertaken by Jewish Israelis for the first 19 years was replaced by day laborers coming in from Gaza and the West Bank. And that was the situation for about 20 years, until the outbreak of the first Palestinian Intifada. Intifada is a word in Arabic which comes from the word, like, I don't speak Arabic that well, but Arabic speakers tell me it's like a dog trying to shake off a flea. It's the shaking off. The shaking off of what? The shaking off of Israeli control. It begins December 1987. There's a traffic accident. 4 Palestinian day laborers are killed, and riots begin to erupt. Young men, young boys, teenagers, as later on in the West Bank, start to throw rocks at Israeli soldiers patrolling through Gaza and predominantly. The defense minister at the time, Yitzhak Rabin, again, left of center Labor Party and a national unity government, is asked when he's visiting the United States what to do, and he says, we shall break the bones of their protesters, because he realized it was just youngsters throwing rocks and some Molotov cocktails maybe at soldiers and tanks. You can see the protests got a little bit more violent. And the most important thing to remember about that first Intifada was that this was this local grassroots uprising. It wasn't orchestrated by the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. They weren't there. They were in Tunisia since Israel successfully kicked them out of Lebanon in 1982. But it was a major watershed in Israeli history because many Israelis, particularly of the political right, realized that there's a real situation that we have to deal with. Those on the left might say to those on the right, it's the occupation, stupid, that, hey, there's millions at that point of Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank who don't want to be ruled by us. How do we deal with that? What do we do with that? That was 1987. It lasts for about 4 or 5 years. And early in that Intifada, and it ends ultimately by the Gulf War in 1990-91 and the Madrid Peace Conference in the fall of 91. But I digress once again. In the midst of this Intifada emerges a new organization, which we all unfortunately know, called Hamas. Hamas is formed 2 months after the Intifada begins, funded, inspired by the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, fundamentalist religious organization, the main opposition group in Egypt, the ones responsible for the assassination of President Anwar Sadat. It became known by its acronym, Hamas, which also means zeal when you translate it into English. And ultimately, its aim is to have Islamic rule all over Palestine. Now, what is Palestine? From the river, unfortunately, we all know the slogan now, to the sea. There can be no territorial compromise. There can be no Jewish state, right? It competes directly with then the PLO terror organization, today the government of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. And its covenant 6 after it was formed, rejects the PLO as the set of arms of Israel and then get rid of the corrupt elements in Palestine. And as their charter says, there is no solution for the Palestinian question except through jihad. Initiatives, proposals are always time and vain endeavors. We strive to raise the banner of Allah over every inch of Palestine. So this is not it is a political organization. It is a social welfare. It is a religious. It is an educational organization. But ultimately, its foundational purpose is to continue to fight for the eradication of the state of Israel. All right? Most places you want to visit or you want to live in designate it as a terror organization. And in fact, they had some terrorism against their own people in 2007, which we'll talk about a little later. So, Intifada begins in 87. Young kids, Molotov cocktails, rocks at soldiers. Into that context comes this new organization whose first phase is to be a social welfare organization. Its second phase is to arm itself, and its third phase is to launch ultimately what we saw on the 7th of October. Fast forward 6 years, when Israel and the Palestinians sign an agreement which allows the Palestinians to have significant control of, I'll put the West Bank up on the right because you can see the colors a little bit better, on the West Bank, and significant control of the Gaza Strip on the left-hand side of the map. And if you notice on the left, you'll see there is the strip, and in that strip are some gray areas, and those gray areas where ultimately there are, I've lost my cursor here, in those gray areas, there are, sorry, mute Sydney, there we go. Their gray areas are where Jews live, Jewish communities here, one Jewish community here, a number over here, mostly in the Gush Katif region. And in the Oslo Accords in the 1990s, Israel relinquishes control of most of the Gaza Strip to the Palestinian Authority, a new government that is responsible for civic and security control. And Israel stays in those small gray areas until a decision, almost a decade later, by the government of right-wing elected, at least, Ariel Sharon, to unilaterally disengage from the Gaza Strip, which means to take down all those gray communities, about 8,300 Jews in 21 communities. The idea essentially was, listen, we thought we'd have a peace partner with the Palestinians, 1994 to 2000. The second Intifada interrupts in 2000, much more lethal because it's automatic weapons and suicide bombers, and Hamas in the 90s already had those suicide bombers being sent into Tel Aviv and other places. Israel says, listen, we cannot, our government at the time, we cannot have a Jewish democratic country and occupy and control all those Palestinians in Gaza. Therefore, we'll pass a law called the Disengagement Plan, or the Pinui and Pitsui, the Disengagement and Compensation Plan, and we will forcibly withdraw the 8,000 Jews in those communities. The Prime Minister said, quote, it's out of strength and not weakness that we are taking this step. However, the opposition within his own party, including that led by now our Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, said we cannot live with this government because we believe that our unilateral disengagement will be seen as a victory for those people, Hamas in particular, and the PLO and the Islamic Jihad, who want to get us out of the Gaza Strip. Some of you might remember in the summer of 2005, there was a painful, almost a civil war actually in Israel, over people who refused to leave their homes, Jews, forcibly evicted by Jewish police and Jewish soldiers of the IDF. A year after, there are no more Jews left, there's no more Jewish property left in Gaza. The Palestinian Authority has municipal elections in the West Bank on the right and the Gaza Strip down over here. And the majority, you can see, the yellow, is the Fatah party of the PLO, and the majority in green is that of the Hamas party. And Hamas, in its context of a political organization, wins the elections in 2006. And a year later, they forcibly, after they form a government in March, they forcibly kick out the PLO. And you can see the image on the right-hand side, Hamas gunmen sitting in the office of, in this case, I believe it's the office of Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority. When this happens, there are over 100 Palestinians of the PLO killed by Hamas. So we've got a situation where Israel controls Gaza from 67, Palestinian opposition to control in the first Intifada in 1987. We fast forward to the peace process in the 90s. Israel disengages in 2005, and Hamas militarily controls Gaza from 2007. And shortly thereafter, this is when violence begins to escalate. The elections already mentioned beforehand. In response to rocket fire from Hamas into Israel, Israel in 2008 at Hanukkah time launches this operation to try to stop Hamas from shooting rockets toward us. Don't read all of the text here, but rockets don't just fall within 5 miles of Gaza. They fall in big municipalities like Ashkelon and Ashdod and Beersheba. It lasts a little bit shy of 3 weeks, and you'll notice this picture I put up here of a soldier in a house in a basement with all of these very simple rockets that couldn't reach Tel Aviv at that point, but could definitely reach the major populations 25 miles outside of town, outside of Gaza, like Beersheba and Ashdod. And you can see on the map over here, the majority of people were within the green and the blue and the purple strip, but all of a sudden you've got about 1 million people who are living with the threat, not just immediately next to the border, but even further out, of Hamas rockets. 2008, 2009. How does Israel deal with this threat? Well, throughout this period, Israel begins to develop something called the Iron Dome, which I'll come back to in 2 slides. But in the midst of all of this, already at this point, in 2005, Hamas digs a tunnel underground and comes up on the Israeli side of the fence, attacks a tank, and kills a couple soldiers, and kidnaps this young soldier, Gilad Shalit. He was in captivity in Gaza, one soldier, from June of 2006 until October of 2011, 5.5 years. Not a single visit from the Red Cross, no contact directly with his family, and ultimately the government of Israel, notice who's in the picture, on the right, at the time, the commander-in-chief of the IDF, Benny Gantz, today a member, he's now part of the National Unity Government, he's part of the war, former commander-in-chief, he's part of the war cabinet. The prime minister then and the prime minister today, Benjamin Netanyahu, and the defense minister then now, and somebody not in politics, Ehud Barak. What happened? Israel agreed to release 1,027 Palestinian prisoners. It was very controversial, but ultimately the government had to go to sleep and tell its citizens, like yours truly with 3 kids, who at that point my eldest was in the army, we do whatever we can to bring back our boys. Of those 1,027 prisoners, one of them was a man named Yehia Sinwar, who is today the head of Hamas. Israel finally, amazingly, miraculously, with a lot of American financial support, but Israeli technology, creates Iron Dome, makes it operational by the end of 2012. This incredible technology that is able to, literally see a Coke bottle flying really quickly and knock it out of at a 95% rate. It's unbelievable. At the beginning it was 85, 90% effective. Now it's got a 95% success rate. Thinking that today, I was in Jerusalem with my wife, and I saw on my phone there were, sirens in central Tel Aviv. My son and daughter-in-law live in central Tel Aviv. She's 8 months pregnant, not fun to run for a siren, but there was significant damage to a car and a few apartments in the city of Holon this afternoon. So it's not 100% success, but 95 is pretty darn good. Where do Hamas rockets go today? They can go everywhere in Israel, right? We've gone from primitive things stored in basements and made from refitted telephone poles and light fixtures and everything else to something that can go a lot farther. And the technology of Iron Dome is pretty straightforward. Radar detects the speed, the velocity, and the arc of the rocket, determines whether it's going to land in the ocean, in an agricultural field, or in an urban area, and then sends an interceptor rocket out to intercept it along the way. Pretty miraculous. How many of these batteries are there around the country? It's classified, I'd guess probably in the multiple dozens by this point. I know in my town we have one, and an incredible job. Incredible job, because somewhere in the area, I lost the number, over 12,000 rockets That number. 12,000 rockets have been shot at Israel. There has been damage on property, but you can count on one hand, if even that, the number of people who have been killed by over 12,000 rockets shot in populated areas. Just to put that in some kind of context. We spend billions of dollars, and we continue to spend billions of dollars, and thankfully you American taxpayers pay money as well that resupply us with the interceptor rockets. It's a life-saving thing. Oh, don't want to do that one, sorry. It's a life-saving thing that has changed how we can live in Israel. Another operation, 2014. 3 kids were kidnapped in Gush Etzion by Hamas terrorists. Israel tries to look for the Hamas leadership in the West Bank. Hamas doesn't like this. They shoot rockets at us. And we have a watershed event for a number of reasons. Reason number one, yours truly had his firstborn involved for 50 days in Gaza. It's one thing to grow up in North America. It's another to move here and have kids in the military. 2, there were 3 dozen tunnels that were dug from Gaza with an attempt to try to penetrate and infiltrate into Israel. There were dozens of tunnels inside of Gaza used to smuggle from Egypt into Gaza, everything. And there was this whole, what is referred to as the metro, the underground, all throughout the Gaza Strip. To put it in context, the IDF said last week, 800 shafts to tunnels have been uncovered so far in Gaza, 500 have been destroyed. Just to put that in context. And we know, since October 7th, Hamas leadership has very clearly told the world, sitting in their beautiful homes in Qatar or in Beirut, very clearly, the leadership has said, well, we use the foreign aid money that we got in order to defend ourselves and to protect and to, he didn't say to use, to make rockets, but to build their underground city. We're not supposed to take responsibility for our citizens. That's for the UN and the World Bank and everyone else. Spend billions of dollars on those terror tunnels. The other reason it was a watershed was it was the longest continuous military engagement we've had. Longer than the War of Independence, continuously, right? Longer than the Yom Kippur War, as traumatic as that was. Definitely longer than the 6-Day War, right? Huge. 7 over 50 weeks of fighting going on. And finally, I think was another major one that all of the Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, Eilat and Modin, and Ben Gurion Airport. Here is a sign at Ben Gurion Airport that showed people that if the siren goes off, where you can go to seek cover. And at that time, it was very traumatic for Israelis. Why? Because for the first time, foreign airlines stopped landing in Ben Gurion for a few days. Now, unfortunately, that's the present reality. If you want to come to Israel, and you should, the only way to get here is El Al, because Delta and United and American, all the other airlines who used to fly here, and European airlines aren't flying anymore because of the situation. So very significant developments in 2014. And ever since, every round of violence, and the last one until 2023 was almost 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago, in May, over 2 weeks, the 4th round of violence between Israel and Hamas. And as my last slide, I have this picture up here because I took a screenshot from TV, and it gives you a sense of what life has become like for the rest of Israel. So in 2021, there were rockets which were shot all over the country, but the majority around Gaza. And one night watching, you can see on the right-hand side, it tells you from the Home Front Command their rocket warnings and where they are. And this young lady, I know her, she's a journalist. She lives at Kibbutz Kfar Aza. And there, if you can read Hebrew, it says in the middle of her speaking that her kibbutz, members of her kibbutz have to go into their safe room. And I end with this slide because that's where we were until, let me stop sharing. That's where we were until the 6th of October, 2016. We'd had a handful of rounds of violence with Gaza, where their technology got better and better and better, and they would shoot rockets not just to those communities 5 miles from the border, not just to the bigger towns 25 miles away, Beersheba, Ashkelon, and Ashdod, but to Tel Aviv and to Jerusalem and to the airport intentionally right next to where I live. And the belief in Israel was that that was the normal. There was an element of deterrence vis-a-vis Hamas, that every once in a while something would happen and we would target one of their military leaders and then they'd shoot rockets at us and it would escalate. It would last a few days, a week or whatever, and the people living next to the border would have to vacate. That was the situation. We invested billions of dollars, and I say we, and I mean us taxpayers, in order to build whatever technology could invent in order to protect us. The most sophisticated fencing system with all sorts of electronic sensors, with all sorts of cameras and automatic shooting machines. The most sophisticated subterranean anti-tunnel, barrier. Billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars, thinking that as long as every once in a while there's a low ember of violence and we open up the faucet a little bit and we continue to supply electricity and we continue to allow 17,000 at that time in October Gazans to work in Israel every day, and we continue to give money that Qatar is giving in literally suitcases of cash to the Hamas leadership, we will buy quiet until that next little round of violence. That was where we were vis-a-vis Gaza until the 6th of October, exactly 50 years after the Yom Kippur War. Little did we know, and little did we have the audacity to believe that just as we were surprised on October 6, 1973, so too were we surprised on October 7th, 2023. With that, Mark, I turn it over to you to facilitate any questions.
Michael, take a sip. You deserve it after speaking like that. Well, I think you all get an idea about, and we got it firsthand this past June. And as I said before, for those that came late, Michael and I have traveled together to Poland on the March of the Living, and we've worked together. And really, it's such a privilege to have you. So, at this point, I see Larry and Kathy Hurwitz here, and Mike, every Monday at 4 p.m. for the past 3.5 years, we've been doing an Israel update at this exact time. And Larry always gets the first chance at saying anything that he wants or asking any questions. And I'm Rabbi Pomerantz would agree that I'm a big tradition type person. So Larry, if you would like to ask anything, please unmute yourself and please meet Mike Hollander. Michael,
I'm new to this, unless Kathy wants to ask the question. I mean, I'm an equal opportunity question answer.
There you
so
go.
Whatever works best.
But please put your questions in the chat group after this. But Larry, please go ahead. Larry.
Now, thank you for that wonderful rollout of history. It's amazing. In 1980, Kathy and I had the privilege of traveling to Yamit in the Sinai. And to get there, we had to go through Gaza City. And we turned to each other and said, this can't last. This is impossible. So everyone's talking about the day after. And I know that we're not there yet in your discussions, but help us see beyond today.
Well, thank you for the question, because it allowed me to answer it in a more complicated, indirect way. And that is that in 1982, after 15 years, Israel made a decision that it was worth the peace with Egypt to take down and leave the Sinai Peninsula lock, stock, and oil barrel, and there was oil there, and the huge, as you saw in one of the maps earlier, this massive buffer between Israel and our greatest enemy and our greatest threat, Egypt, and it divided Israel. In fact, one of the leaders of the opposition to the withdrawal from Yamit in the spring of '82 was a guy named Tzachi Negbi, who's now the national security advisor of the government. So things change in Israel. We reluctantly agreed to leave Lebanon in May of 2000. We reluctantly agreed to leave Gaza in 2005. Zionism, since the late 19th century, has always been about establishing communities. The term settlement today has a negative connotation all over the world. But Jewish communities of Tel Aviv, Jewish communities of Kfar Darom, in the Gaza Strip, Jewish communities of Yamit, Jewish communities in the northern part of Judea, Samaria, the West Bank have been taken down as well. So Jews and Israel are prepared to pay the price to remove settlements. That's point number one. Point number two, how can we guarantee that people can live comfortably close to the Gaza Strip or close to Lebanon? The elephant in the room, which I haven't talked about, is Lebanon. I have a daughter, son-in-law, spoke to her an hour ago. They have not been home. Last night was the first night they were home. They live in a kibbutz about 4 miles from the border with Lebanon. They weren't forcibly evacuated, but all of their friends were because they're closer to the border, and they're not going to be home for probably 6 months. And they don't know if they can even feel comfortable going back home unless something happens vis-a-vis Hezbollah on our northern border. And what's that going to be? What's that going to look like? Is that going to be a massive military operation on the scale of Gaza against a much more seriously weaponized rival, Hezbollah, than Hamas? So when will Israelis feel comfortable to live along the border with Lebanon? And when will Israelis feel comfortable to live along the border with Gaza? Will it be when there's not a single rocket left in Gaza? Are we ever going to be there or not? I don't have an answer to that. I don't know what deterrence will mean in the future, given what we've just experienced. But I do know that in the short term, Israelis, pretty much across the board, are determined to fulfill at least one aim of the war, and that is to ensure that Hamas will no longer be able to threaten us. There was an article, even I was reading it today, actually an hour ago in the New York Times, about one community. I know people who live there. I've been there many times. Kfar Aza, I was there last week. Devastated, horrible destruction, people killed, 18 people hostages, 11 have been returned, 7 are still hostages there. 50% of the buildings were destroyed on the kibbutz. How can people go back to their homes along the border, on the one hand? On the other hand, someone said, but if we don't go back to our home, then what's going to happen? Then the next year or the next round is going to be Ashkelon. And the next round it's going to be Ashdod. And the next round it's going to be Tel Aviv. So I don't personally live adjacent to the border with Gaza, but how do we get to that point? I don't have an answer. I will quote Micha Goodman. If you haven't read his book, Catch 67, you should. Great mind, one of the greatest living, I think, thinkers in Israeli society. And he spoke to a solidarity group I was guiding last week, and he said that everything that we know has to be revisited because Israel has to recreate itself. 75 years we've lived with certain assumptions. We have to have different assumptions in the future. So in order for people to feel comfortable to go back and live on Kibbutz Nachal Oz and Nir Oz and Kfar Aza and Be'eri and Re'im or in Metula and Kiryat Shmona, we've got to see things differently. And we're in the midst of that now. And I don't see definitively, and I can't put out a roadmap for that, Larry, as to where that's going to be. But that day will have to be different. And that day will be October 8th, because we're still in the midst of October 7th. And it'll take a while till we actually get out of that.
Thank you.
I know I didn't give you a comfortable answer, but
Unfortunately, it broke up a little bit. I
I
couldn't.
don't have a comfortable, clear answer.
Yes, thank you.
It broke up a little at the end there. As you see, I just put the article that Mike just mentioned. I put the link to that. We have a question, Mike. October 7th left us with so many questions. One October 6th question is, how did the Israeli government leave the border along Gaza so unprotected, with it taking hours for the IDF to show up in force? And I would imagine you're going to spend more time on this in the next part. So keep everyone a little bit in suspense as well.
The short answer is we'll only know the answer in the future. In other words, the military, every single leader in the military, from military intelligence, the head of the Mossad to the head of the military, the commander-in-chief, have all said that we bear responsibility for what happened. Let's fight the war now, and we'll figure out what happened and correct that in the past. And the truth of the matter is that Israelis have significant loss in confidence in the government, but they still have, in spite of the fiasco of October 7th, a tremendous amount of faith in the military. And that's largely because the military is the people. You know, we have a standing army of about 100,000. Reservists are double that today. And there's a lot of confidence. And if we're able to, restore order, it's going to be on the shoulders of these men and women, by the way. There are actually a significant number of women now in combat on the news a lot in Israel. But there's no clear answer outside of, short answer, I think, is that we were like in 1973, guilty of a word which is biblical Hebrew. It appears, I think, numerous times in Genesis, Numbers, and even in Chronicles 1 and 2, and that is conceptia. I joke. The word obviously is English, the concept. The conception was that, as I mentioned earlier, all of the technology that we spent billions on, the Iron Dome missile interceptor, and Iron Dome is one of 4 technologies to intercept missiles. But there are other technologies like David's sling and the arrow, which intercept missiles that rockets and drones that come from Yemen, 800 miles away, right, for longer term threats. But that technology, the technology of the cameras, the technology of the fence, the technology of the underground anti-tunnel, all of that essentially meant that we relied more on technology than we did on presence of soldiers, right? And actually having land a buffer zone. So I didn't answer the question fully, Mark, but I will in 2 sessions down the line. But we are part of our trauma, I think, and part of it goes back to your question, Ari. Had a people who felt for years that they were safe and protected go back to a place knowing that, not that they were necessarily lied to, but that line that they were safe and protected was not right. And what will it take for somebody to feel comfortable going to sleep at night, knowing even if you have a safe room, they'll, throw Molotov cocktails into it and burn the rest of the house down and throw grenades through the door. It doesn't really matter. So we were prisoners in a sense of believing in something that ultimately failed us. And something will have to be different in the future to answer kind of both of those questions.
So on that note, Mike, and again, I want to leave everyone a little bit of suspense because part 2 is this Sunday morning at 9 a.m. And we wanted to vary the times a little bit to give people a chances to come on. And so on Sunday morning, we invite you to, get up. If you do exercise, get a cup of coffee, open your computer, and we look forward to having a morning session with Mike. Part 2 is this Sunday. I've got notes of everyone who's here, and I will send out the link for that. And there's going to be a surprise as well. Again, I can't tell you now because it's a surprise. But once you register, you will hear more news about that Sunday morning surprise that will come along with session number 2. But for now, I want to really say thank you to Mike Hollander for joining us from Modi'in, which is a community that has changed greatly over the years since Mike moved there. And he'll maybe share a little bit more about his family. Mike, before we go, share that beautiful picture of your family. Leave us with that nice picture for a second.
Oh,
show it to us.
Yeah, that's already 4 years ago. I gotta figure it out.
All right, here's a lovely picture.
There
this
it
is Mike's
is.
family. You know what? Why not look at a beautiful family? I know Mike's wife, and I've met a few of the kids, and they're exactly what you think they would be because it's a really special family. So Mike, I want to say thank you to you.
And most importantly, Mark, this young lady in the dress is about to give birth to our first grandson, our first grandchild in mid-January.
So in Hebrew, we don't say Mazal Tov. We'll say Mazal Tov when the baby comes, hopefully, and everything will be well, thank God. But we say B'Shah Tovah, in a good hour. And so to all of you, thank you for being here. We're going to end the recording now, and we look forward to seeing you Sunday morning at 9 a.m. for part 2 of our series with Mike Hollander. Have a great night, everyone, and thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Mark, and thank you.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.